Rand manipulation. What happened?
Did you manipulate the rand?
No.
So did they not do it?
Walk us through.
There were rogue traders that were based primarily in New York and London, and rogue traders created chat rooms where they discussed how to influence currency movements in order to achieve particular profit margins. And they did this for a very long time.
Greylisting. We were greylisted last year. What does it mean?
It means we're now grey.
Welcome back to Palatable Politics, a show where we take the complexity out of politics and make it palatable for you. With me, your host, TJ Maslela. Welcome to the show. In today's show, we're going to be discussing the financial industry. And here to give us insight is none other than Mr. Khaya Sithole. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone who's watching.
Yeah. So you have, before this, asked us to specify that, make it clear that you are not a doctor.
I'm not Matthew Lani.
You're not Matthew Lani. Mm-hmm. You are a CA. You had your postgrad in financial strategy, master's in accounting. You are the treasurer of ABIP, and you a former talk show host and a social activist.
Sounds about right. Yes, I think I remember.
What else is there? Tell us your journey. How did you become, and how did you even manage to be all of these?
Man, I was young. Maybe naive, and I decided to study accounting many years ago, over 20 years ago. I wanted to be a teacher, but apparently there wasn't a lot of money involved, so everyone discouraged it. So I studied accounting, and as soon as that was done, I went into teaching. So I went into academia about 12 years ago. A couple of universities, enjoyed that part. And then I started writing on Facebook because I was sometimes bored. And I'd write a whole lot of long things, and once I'd written them, people asked me to come and explain what I'd said on Facebook, on radio. So that's how I got into radio.
Like the podcast.
And then
also,
those that listened to radio then said, come and say the same thing on TV. So that's how I got into that space. Completely accidental. I had really no interest in it. But it just sort of became a thing that I got swept into over a period of time. And since then, it's obviously been quite interesting to learn how people engage with news and how people engage with information. It's been remarkably distressing to watch how facts have become much more negotiable in the world we live in. And information is now really a question of what people prefer to say rather than what the facts say. And that, I think, is the great tragedy of where we are today. So when you look at the way information is now exchanged, I think many years ago when we were young, the way in which information was exchanged was very, say traditional in nature. So if you wanted to research something, you go to a library. You want to dig up some stuff, you go to an encyclopedia, you look up at a dictionary. And of course, one benefit of that is that it gave you the opportunity to sort of then discover new things on the way there. So you might be looking for one word, and then the word that comes afterwards is particularly intriguing. So that particular process of soliciting information got lost a bit in the fluidity of the modern exchanges, so social media in particular and the internet. And for a long time, when those were trusted, when they had credibility, where you could trust them, then it was fine. But I think when we democratized the space, we lost some of the important safeguards around, the sanctity and the veracity of what people exchange out there. So when you read, you have to think twice about, well, what is the source? How credible is the source? And does this make sense? Far too many people do not go through that particular process. So people just get into the habit of sharing and duplicating information that isn't information at all. And we now know that it can have significant consequences for democracy as we know it. Cambridge Analytica 2016 was obviously the most obvious example of what happens when information gets manipulated and abused for particular nefarious ends. And I don't think it has gotten better since then. In fact, it's probably getting worse. Cambridge Analytica may have fallen by the wayside, but in its absence, you've had this prevalence of I don't know if you want to call them the non-existent individuals, but the bots that seem to be quite capable of spreading information, and it is quite dangerous in my view.
Okay, that's a mouthful, and a big discussion for another day. Right now, ABIP, the Association of Black securities and investment professionals? What is its objective? What's it trying to achieve?
Wow. 30 years ago, the question was very different, and the answer was very clear. So obviously, the opening up of the South African economy meant that you weren't just opening up to international role players and international economies, but also to South African citizens, which is something that hadn't existed before. So obviously, it was very clear that there was a big representation problem, particularly in those industries that were not very well socialized in the Black community. So in the Black community, everyone knew what a teacher was, everyone knew what a doctor was, and everyone knew what a policeman was, because you had seen enough to sort of know, oh, that's a particular job, that's a particular profession.
Yeah, everything was straightforward.
Yeah, so there was a socialization component to that. New industries, industries that weren't very well understood within those communities, naturally meant that very few people took an interest in them. So if people don't take an interest in them, then they're not going to get represented there. So that's one of the big issues there. And then, of course, there was the question of the pathways into accessing those industries. How do people become an actuary? How do people become an accountant? And it was very clear that you couldn't rely on the system to organically transform itself in order to eventually get people there. So there's a lot of these institutions that were then set up in order to centralize the conversation, to say, what are the issues? Is it a question of social awareness? Then somebody must run a schools program to create that social awareness. Is it a question of financing the journey? And if that's the case, somebody must come up with a funding model, whether it's scholarships or whatnot, in order for people to stand a chance of accessing those. So there were quite a lot that were set up, and ABIP is one of those that was set up. Some others were set up much earlier. So ABASA was set up in 1985, which is obviously just about 10 years after you were born. Depending on your age. So ABIP comes through in 1995, 10 years later, and you've got the South African Actuaries Development Program, SADP, which comes through much later on. And so there's been these efforts to try and break the barriers to access and break the barriers of representation over the past 30 years. Has it worked? I do not know. It's a matter of interpretation. It goes back to the question of what is the definition of it working? There's one answer. The answer is that the demographics of the country say X, Y, Z, so therefore the profession should mirror that. That's a simple answer. That is obviously the naive answer, because the pathways to access and, success are so vastly different across different parts of society. It would be naive to assume that that's going to happen overnight, but that is the utopia. And that should be the reference point that all these organizations measure themselves by. I don't know if they do a very good job of that, to say, well, if we started with representation of 10% and the target is 80%, what does it take to get us there? What are the resources that need to get us there? What are the policies that need to get us there? Because you actually have to champion for the policies. Because in order to get these things right, it actually shouldn't focus on individuals. It should focus on institutions. So I believe in the capacitation of institutions rather than the capacitation of cohorts. Because once you've gone through one cohort and everyone says, oh, we think we fixed the problem, then you realize that when the next cohort shows up, then you actually haven't fixed the problem. So you must fix the structures and the institutions. And that's why organizations like ABIP had a case for existence 30 years ago.
And in today's age, in 2024?
Well, it's a question of purpose. Well, what are we trying to do? What are we doing in order to achieve the things that we're trying to do? It's a process of ongoing interrogation. I do not know if everybody engages in that interrogation. So the reason I think there's still a case is that we haven't got to the numbers. We haven't got to a fraction of the utopia that I mentioned. So the utopia is that 80% of CAs in the country should be black. 80% of actuaries in the country should be black. And clearly we're not there. So for as long as you haven't reached that utopia, there is a reason for existence. Now, whether that reason for existence is then supported by the right instruments and the right interventions to then give life to that reason for existence, that is what these institutions and organizations have to continuously interrogate. And whether they're getting it right is a matter of it's a matter of perception in one instance. I'm probably less patient than most people. I think things should happen at a much faster pace, but some of these things take many years to get there. To develop an actuary takes the better part of 10 years. So you can't be naive about it and say, oh, we just want to get these things done tomorrow. It doesn't happen like that. And it requires institutions and individuals that have the patience and the resources. I think the resources are a big element of it.
Yeah.
So the case definitely still exists, and whether everybody is doing it the right way is a matter of individual and institutional interrogation that all of them hopefully engage in on a continuous basis.
Okay. So would I be wrong in saying that, from what you've said, in terms of also the origin of ABIP, is this to formulate policy, to champion?
To influence policy. Government is the only one that's fully responsible for implementing policy. You can only influence it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the influencing of policy, championing, and then on the other side is for government to implement. And now you spoke about the institutions and getting capacity there. On that, with the capacity in institutions, there's the thing of the professionals shying away from public sector. Why do you think that is?
I don't know where the data comes from to support that.
Okay.
It's a narrative that people say that professionals shy away from the public sector, but I left the private sector to go and work at public higher education institutions. So I could argue that everyone that I worked with in public higher education institutions were people that literally left the private sector to migrate to the public sector. Now, the issue here seems to be that some parts of the private sector and some parts of the corporate are less interesting or less lucrative to other people. I would never work in municipality. I don't have an interest in the type of work that goes on there. I could work in university. That's still part of the public sector.
Okay.
So what we have to be able to interrogate is when people issue the statements, what exactly are they referring to? So if you are looking at doctors, where do doctors work primarily? Doctors work primarily in the public sector because it caters for 80% of the health industry. The private sector caters for a small fraction. So if the doctors had to depend on just the private sector, they wouldn't have jobs. So there's a lot of these issues that require much greater interrogation. If you look at the education system, the public school system is about 25,000 schools. Independent schools make up a small fraction of that. So if everybody say that, we're shying away from the public sector to the private sector, if you're a teacher, I don't think that theory makes much sense because the private sector doesn't have the capacity to absorb the number of teachers that exist out there. So 25,000 public schools, that's where the jobs for teachers are going to be, and that's the public sector. It's not the private sector primarily. So with every sector, there clearly are elements that the public sector is probably the first place to go to. There are also parts of the economic system where the private sector is the primary player and the dominant player, and there's nothing wrong with that. So obviously, if you're talking about banking, well, the state doesn't own a bank. So when people say that I'm a banker, well, I can't go and work for the state because the state doesn't have a bank. Does that represent a person who shied away from the public sector? I don't think so. It's a person who went to do a job that they were capable of doing, and that was in the banking sector, which is a private sector.
Should the state own a bank?
No.
Okay. And
no. The state's role is to figure out what is necessary in order to create an economic system that is conducive to the problems that you're trying to solve. So when you ask the question about a state bank, the starting point should be, well, in the current banking architecture, is there a gap? And is this the type of gap that can only be addressed by the state having an operating bank or participating in that sector? If that is the answer to the question, then the answer is yes, you must have a state bank. But you can't just simply say that, well, let's have a state bank, because the question of purpose is far more important. So you always have to go back to the question of what is the issue that you're trying to address. Are you saying that we do not have enough banks in the country? That's the first question. And if that is the answer, then the question is, are you saying that a new bank must emerge? That is a secondary question. Then the third question is that, are you saying that this bank must be owned by the state and operated by the state? And the question is, why? So you have to be able to answer the difficult questions before you come up with a conclusion.
Okay. The gap in finance, or access to finance, let's rather say that. I would assume, in part of my research, in my honors, one of the things I researched was the access to capital in SA and the centralized system. Is that something that's sustainable for development? And when you look at something like a China, you have different banks per sector or even per province. Do you think something like that in SA would help in terms of development?
Well, let's see. We're comparing a 1 billion community versus South Africa, 62 million. So that's the first issue here. And then the secondary question is the proposition that access to finance is limited because there's the bank missing? Or because if that's the question, you can create a new bank, but if it plays by the same rules that all of them use, what difference does it make? So a lot of people don't actually remember that many years ago, I think it was COSATU that championed this question of access to finance. So we have something called the Red October movement. I don't know if you've ever heard about it.
Yeah.
So what COSATU wanted is that they wanted to make sure, the SACP and COSATU, that the system was far more accommodating to the South African problems. So there were a lot of people that didn't have access to banking because in order to open a bank account, you have to have paid particular transaction costs. And when you don't have a regular income, those transaction costs are very punitive, particularly if there's a monthly fee of maintaining the bank account and there's no money. So suddenly you find yourself in the negative. So the question of how expensive banking was addressed to a big drive towards saying that we must actually create what we refer to as access products. And access products were just to create a bank account that is accessible to as many citizens as possible. And it was actually called the Mzansi Bank Account. So all the banks collectively signed up for it, and they all created access products, except obviously for the banks that couldn't, like the international investment banks, where the business model just didn't accommodate that. So it's something that was confronted many years ago, and many more South African citizens are now in a position to transact or be able to open a bank account. And it's becoming even more cheaper now and more accessible with new banks coming through that don't have the costs of big infrastructure, because a big part of the bank charges was the fact that, well, if you had to build the infrastructure and branches everywhere else, those branches have to be funded, and bank charges is one of the ways in which you can create that funding mechanism. So the access for individuals has been addressed. The question of access for businesses remains very difficult, because what is very clear is that if you are coming up with a business ideas are by very definition a speculation about the appetite for your product to be sold in the market, the interest for the product to be maintained, and the ability to stay ahead of the curve so that people do not supersede you and do better and, kill your business. So all business proposals have an inherent element of risk. The problem with South African institutions is that they're very risk averse. So they're like, hey, until we've seen the first million you've made in this business, we're not going to be the ones that bank on it. And that's a problem of the attitudes that people have towards those particular institutions. So the other big issue is that with a market so small, when it comes to banking, if one bank has taken the view that we don't do risk, it's very unlikely that the next bank is going to say we're going to do it, because then the possibility of them getting it wrong means that they're going to be in a much worse position than their competitor banks. So everyone looks around and say, if no one else is taking on this risk, I also shouldn't. So that is not particularly useful. And what would help is that the diversity of institutions with a very different but well-informed risk appetite matrix to be able to say that, look, if we believe that small businesses must be supported, then collectively we must all agree or acknowledge that maybe 80% of the businesses that end up in our tables are going to fail. But you're not going to find the 20% if you reject everyone. So let's find a way of actually creating an ecosystem that supports as many of these potential businesses as possible, with the hope that the 20% that emerge, or even if you're lucky, 30% that emerge, do so well, they actually validate the risk that you've taken on the system at large. So people focus on the risk at a singular, business level or singular business proposal level, rather than the big institutional risk. And that simply means that a lot of them simply say, find someone else willing to take the risk, come back to us once you've been proven. And that's a big problem that we have with the banking system in the country. Would an additional bank address that? I don't know if it would, unless it has a completely different risk modeling exercise. So South Africa actually has a lot of state financing institutions.
Yeah, that's coming there to that.
So the curiosity has always been that people seem to want a transactional bank to actually play in that space. It's not very clear why. I think there's a bigger case to be made of saying that state financing institutions should find a much more agile or a better way of actually supporting the business ecosystem. And that for me is much more important than saying, let's just have another state bank. I need to know what it is that it's going to do. So some people that say they want a state bank are simply saying, let us consolidate the financing institutions, the state bank financing institutions that exist. And that seems to make much more sense to me. Because you're then saying, look, we've already put resources into these particular instruments, but we believe that a much stronger balance sheet would be able to provide much more capital to the businesses that we want to be able to support. That's a much more granular conversation than simply saying that we want a state bank. I mean, people still actually can't explain the distinction between, a state bank, as they call it, and the state being a shareholder in banks that are already profitable and already viable. And why we need to be very clear about what we're trying to achieve is that it is not a cheap exercise to get into the banking space. And if you're going to be using public resources to take such a big gamble, it has to be informed. And you can't afford to risk what little exists in public resources into a speculative exercise without knowing what it is that we actually trying to achieve. So that's quite important.
From the securities aspect, your pension funds, etc., there hasn't been much transformation there. How do you think one can get the current players there to transform and to empower blacks?
So if you ask them, they'll say they're transformed. So that's a problem with the question of how people interpret the essence of transformation. So all the big banks in South Africa will say that they're transformed if you speak to them, as far as they're concerned.
Black CEOs, etc.
Well, there aren't that many black CEOs, but everywhere else they'll be like, we'll tick the boxes.
Okay.
And the interesting element of it is that that definition itself is multifaceted. So I used to write about the auditing industry, which I just thought was like the most dumbest thing I'd ever seen, in that everyone said that they're level on BEE, but if you asked every single person who works there to say, as far as you look around, is this place transformed? And they just said, no, we don't think so. So the interesting question was, if the people that work there don't actually say anecdotally or instinctively that this place is transformed, what is it that actually gets measured in order to say these things? And you then have to go through the scorecards and understand the different elements and then say, well, actually, if the score is this, then you achieve that. And therefore, according to these scorecards, you are regarded as transformed. But what that creates is this very, very problematic question of perception, in that if citizens themselves do not understand how we've decided to define the elements of transformation and how we've decided to measure them, then it simply becomes a matter of, well, they say they're transformed. The law agrees with them. I don't understand how the law got there. I don't understand how those conclusions are reached, but that's what it is. So a lot of people, when you ask them, is South African economy transformed? The answers are clearly no. But when you speak to individual institutions, individual CEOs, everyone's like, yeah, we've done all that needs to be done. And it's just like, oh, so how does this work? And the reality is that public policy is always a matter of trade-offs and concessions, right? So from a public policy perspective, you started off on day one and say, what is a transformed banking sector? The answer would be, well, are we talking shareholders? Oh, if a country is 80% black, then shareholders must be 80% black. So the answers will be very linear, right? And then you say, wait, hold on. What does it take in order to be a shareholder at a bank? It takes access to capital. It takes access to resources. Then you look around and you say, well, do 80% of citizens have access to capital and resources, discretionary capital and resources for them to invest in a bank? And then suddenly the answer says no. And then now that's where the concessions and the trade-off starts to say, well, you can't set the rules that say that 80% of our shareholders must be black when you yourselves know that that's the capacity doesn't exist then. So you start off by lowering the baseline. And then eventually what happened in 2004, you get to an answer that says that, look, for shareholding, you need to have 25% of your shareholders being black. How do you link the 25% versus the demographics of the country, and what is the point? Then there's secondary problems that you say, okay, even at 25%, how much does it cost to actually buy a 25% stake in a bank? And it turns out to be billions. Yeah. And you're like, how many people have the billions? None of them do. So we must actually support them, to give them the loans in order to be able to buy this 25% stake. But who are you going to give it to? Like, well, let's just choose a few. So you create a couple of billionaires that are ANC aligned in particular, and then you say, well, those are the ones that we're going to support. That's the first problem. What the biggest problem is, for all of these people, you then say to them, okay, because we've had to borrow your money in order to buy your stake, when you are supposed to receive a dividend every year, we'll take the dividend and we'll pay back the loan because, that's the only way you can do this. So we'll do that for the next 5, 7, 10 years. And by the time we get to the 10 years and this loan has been paid off using the dividends, you will suddenly start receiving the dividends and you can do with them as you see fit. And 10 years later, these people are like, I've been patient for 10 years without the ability to do anything with my dividends. Now I'm going to do what I want. And then they sell their stake. And then suddenly 10 years later, from 25%, you're not at 25%. So it was Gwede Mantashe who started this conversation. If you once empowered, are you always empowered? Because the mining industry was like, well, we spend so much money creating these deals. Now these people are selling off because they're free to do so. You can't stop them. And then the question is, well, what exactly was the big idea here? Because if it was just a once-off thing to empower a couple of billionaires, just say it out loud so that we do not labor under this false impression that there's going to be some element of perpetuity in this. And it's a problem that was unresolved, and it's a problem that remains unresolved because even now...
Especially in the mining.
Yeah, especially in the mining. So what they try to do is try to link it to the duration of the mining licenses and the mining rights, which means that when it expires, you have to start again. But there's obviously pushback. There's always going to be pushback on that to say, but you guys told us
once
empowered, in 2003 and 2004. We signed up for those rules. So now why do we have to find new people to then empower? And more importantly, why are we empowering people rather than institutions or communities? So it was a model that probably had good intentions, but its execution and its viability, difficult.
Okay. Rand manipulation. What happened?
Did you manipulate the Rand?
No.
I didn't.
I don't have the capacity.
So did anyone do it?
There were reports that it did. I know you've written an article saying something did happen, fix the spread. Walk us through.
There were rogue traders that were based primarily in New York and London, and rogue traders created chat rooms where they discussed how to influence currency movements on a particular day in order to achieve particular profit margins. And they did this for a very long time. No one discovered it until there was another accident. So the accident was the LIBOR scandal, which was actually traders that were manipulating the lending rate. So LIBOR is the London, lending rate, which is a lot of credit transactions use it as a reference point. So in the investigations around the fixing of the lending rate, they then discovered that, there was another scandal in relation to the fixing of the currency. So it was actually an accidental discovery. And when they followed up on that, so they started looking at all the currencies that were mentioned in those chat rooms where the manipulation was being discussed, and the Rand was one of them. So obviously they prosecuted those banks and those traders successfully. I think one of them is still in jail right now. Others have served their sentences. The banks paid fines. So it was a case that was concluded around 2017. And then obviously because the Rand had been one of the affected currencies, it meant that South African authorities took an interest in the case. And they're like, these people manipulated the currency, they manipulated the Rand, so therefore let us pursue a case against them. And that's what the Competition Commission has been trying to do since 2017.
Okay. So the 28 banks, there was nothing like that. Everyone just misread its hype.
Well, you can't say everyone misread it. We didn't write anything. The Competition Commission is one that put together a case. You can't accuse citizens of misreading something because the Competition Commission's case cited 28 banks. Okay. They shouldn't have. It was completely ill-conceived to cite 28 banks, but that's what they did. Okay. And obviously, once you go through all the responses and all the affidavits from the banks, then you start getting seriously worried about the merits of how the case was put together. So when I looked at it, I was like, nah, it's not going to work in this format. So that doesn't mean that there was no manipulation. That doesn't mean that there was no currency rigging. It simply means that whoever put the case together for the Competition Commission screwed it up.
Okay, all right. Staying on the international aspect of things. Greylisting. We were greylisted last year. What does it mean? And how does it
It means we're now grey. Duh.
Well, it's not part of the Rainbow Nation.
Yeah.
What does it mean? How does it impact?
Oh, well, it simply means that our financial system has got serious gaps and loopholes. But we don't have to be greylisted to know that, because Phala Phala was actually the answer to the question. So if anyone asks what greylisting means, Phala Phala is the answer. Because that is one transaction that
money and couches.
Yeah, it's the one transaction that actually illustrates exactly what that whole report, the greylisting report, was about. In that, when you arrive in a country with foreign currency, it has to be declared at the point of entry. When you receive foreign currency as a South African citizen, there's only one question you must ask yourself: am I authorized to deal in foreign currency? And the answer is no. In fact, I think there's a list is but maybe 24, can't remember the number, of authorized dealers. So it's the banks and it's the travel agents. So it's a very small list. It's no longer than 2 pages of authorized dealers, of people who can actually hold and deal in foreign currency. So the fact that somebody came in with it and SARS didn't know about it means that you've got a problem there at the point of entry. The fact that somebody who clearly didn't have the license to hold foreign currency, which was the president's farm, held it for that long until it was stolen, means you've got a particular problem. The fact that even when that was discovered, basically it was like, oops, something happened, but let's move on. That's another problem altogether. So when you look at what should have happened in order to preserve the integrity of the financial flows within the country's borders, clearly we've got too many things that aren't working. So the grey listing is actually a report that says you've got particular issues relating to how money moves in and out of your borders. And when you can't vouch for what's happening within your borders, it becomes very difficult for people to trust you as a transacting destination. So what being on the grey list says is that it's an alert to everyone else that, yeah, you can go and transact with those people, but they can't even explain what happens to money within their borders. And whether those are the type of people you're going to transact with, it's something that you must decide. So that's what the grey listing.
Which also, there's an element of linked to terrorism, etc.
Yeah, because, if money can move in freely within this borders, people can clean it. So they can get it from somewhere else, and then within these borders, they can get into the system. And by the time it emerges, it looks like, it's proper cash. And obviously, people who engage in terrorist activities, they want that type of ecosystem where you can be a drug dealer, for example, and, operating in this offline economy. But then you want that money eventually to be onboarded onto the formal economy so that you can use it. So when you see people buying properties for cash and they can't explain where the money came from, that's a red flag. So why don't we ask these people where the money came from? Where was it withdrawn from? What was the source? What are the origins? The grey listing report simply says South Africa doesn't ask enough of these questions, and when they do ask them, they don't know what to do with the answers.
Okay, fine. So now, apart from asking the questions, if you were president or minister of finance, whoever was supposed to fix it, what would you do? How would you fix it?
I'd firstly refuse to be president or minister of finance.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the first thing I would do. Absolutely refuse.
Okay, what advice would you give then?
Well, I think the one thing that we have to acknowledge is that other institutions in other countries have found a way of creating the type of laws that make it very difficult for these things to happen. So, that FATF report covers a whole lot of countries. And the countries, South Africa used to be in the good list. So you simply go and speak to your peers and say, well, what does it take to be on the good list? For transactions of this nature, what safeguards do you have? And how easy is it to implement and monitor those safeguards? And some would be good and some would be impractical. So you have to actually go and learn from whoever has managed to find a way around these things, because South Africa is not the only place where these things happen. It happens everywhere, but other countries have found ways of identifying them early enough and prosecuting proactively enough. One of the biggest criticisms with South Africa is that, well, actually, even when they discover something has gone wrong, we don't seem to know what happens with it. So if you look at the Steinhof case, it's been 6 years. Like, what exactly has happened?
What did happen there? Accounting irregularities.
I wasn't there. Ivan, call Marcus. I don't have his number anymore.
And he's chilling.
It was corruption. People do that, they fudge numbers, and that's what happened. in the Steinhof case. And eventually the nature of transactions became so complicated and so entangled, even he lost track of what he had said to whom at what point in time. So when people then were asking questions, he suddenly couldn't reconcile what had happened. It's a common occurrence. We saw it also in the case of Steinhof. In the case of Tongaat, where suddenly it became very clear that those that were responsible for maintaining the hoax suddenly lost track of all the steps that are necessary to maintain it, because you have to remember every single step that you've manipulated in order to be able to maintain that veneer of, everything working well. And if you forget one particular element of it, somebody may pick up and say, but this thing doesn't make sense in relation to everything else. And that's how it all just comes tumbling down. So it was something that a lot of people know happens, but we always hope that there's enough institutional checks and balances to identify it. I don't think preventing it is likely to happen, but you want to be able to identify that this doesn't make sense and know what to do with it. And in the case of Steinhof, I think it was such a big organization with so many moving parts. I don't know if any of the board members had the capacity to actually understand what was going on. So they were paid to oversee it, but they just couldn't actually explain what they were overlooking. It's something that happens a lot. And when you have directors who should be providing this oversight, and you've got executives who are regarded as just too smart to fail, people gravitate towards saying, oh, no, he's probably right. So I don't think any of those board members could look at a transaction and say, Marcus, you're talking nonsense. They just thought he knew much more than they did. He told them he knew much more than they did. So when you have that particular problem, the risk of things going horribly wrong is much higher. And you will see, if you study the Tongaat case study, it's the same thing. If you look at all the Ponzi schemes that we've heard about, if you hear about Wirecard and the fraud that was created there, it's kind of the same template. You have these mavericks who everybody just believes they know much more, so therefore will gravitate towards agreeing with them rather than challenging them. And in the South African case, I don't know if we have enough people that challenge within the boardrooms, so it's risky.
Yeah. One last thing. I forgot to mention it earlier. There's this Regulation 28, which is said to be the key to enabling transformation and empowerment.
My understanding of it was that one of the key elements was the question of where should pension funds invest? And because they've got access to deep capital, they've got access to patient capital, which is very important. So should they be taking a more proactive role in supporting the local economy? That's one of the key deliberations that everybody always has in relation to pension funds. So when you look at the regulations, regulations try to sort of guide the industry on what can and cannot be done. And we do know that if left to its own devices, every asset manager that says, look, I think the South African economy is underperforming, they'd happily take all their assets and invest them offshore, which means that there'll be nothing left to be invested in the country. So that's a risk that has to be addressed. And some of these regulations are then geared towards saying that, well, you can only invest so much out of the country, so offshore investments. And we do not want you to invest everything offshore because we actually need investments to happen in South Africa. So if you then are able to guide or limit what can be done, then at least you're giving the South African economy or the South African business a fair chance of accessing that investment capital. So that's actually the much bigger issue here. Now, the question of how that industry will or will not transform is really influenced by the question of access to resources. So it's not easy to start an asset management company. It's not easy to be, a lone ranger out there. And those that do start, they have to be supported. And one of the big challenges is that when you are investing other people's money, whether it's pensioners, for example, or workers, the question is, are you getting the best returns out there? And what tends to happen, unfortunately, is that much established businesses that have been there for a very long term with a very long established track record, they are in a position to demonstrate their capacity to get this right. New businesses struggle to get the same buy-in from asset managers. So, because it's a balance of saying, well, I'd definitely like to support new businesses, but at the end of the year, my trustees are going to ask me that, well, your returns are a bit dodgy, and you seem to have invested in small asset managers that probably didn't have the institutional capacity, because you also need to hire a lot of people to manage things properly. So it becomes a difficult point of deliberation to say, how do you balance it? How do you ensure that you get the returns that your trustees expect and the people whose money you're managing expect? And how do you then also support new businesses? And clearly in South Africa, we haven't found the right formula, because if we had found the right formula, everyone would say, this is what should happen. This is how you balance the needs of, superior returns, investment returns, versus transforming the sector at large. And people also still struggle with explaining who exactly should drive the transformation agenda. Unless it's a national directive that says we must all do it, why should I take the bold first step? Because if it turns out that, I take the bold first step and these things are all risk associated, and I maybe choose the wrong partner to partner with, everyone would say, you see, you shouldn't have done that. So you want it to be an industry-wide move, rather than hoping that some people will take the plunge and say, we're going to do this, because it creates an uneven playing field. And I think that's probably not the best way to do things.
Okay. For your guys' benefit, we'll also just have a short reel in terms of what the Regulation 28 speaks to in terms of the allocation of resources for asset managers. But thank you for making time for us, educating us, giving us insight, and telling us no one manipulated the rand. And you didn't have to be a doctor to do that.
Somebody did. I just don't think it was you and I.
Who was it?
I've got a list of names. There's actually 38 names.
Okay.
Of traders who were involved in those chat rooms.
Okay. The internationally, but not necessarily the rand over here, the 28 banks. But guys, for more insights, like, subscribe, share, follow, and see you next week.